So it's my pleasure to talk about kind of the Stockton, California experience. But to begin with, I've been dealing with a lot of researchers like my fellow police chiefs have over the recent years, and going with best practices and trying to do what works with evidence-based strategies. One thing we do know is there is no magic bullet to the problem of violent crime. There's no one-size-fits-all template that can just be applied to community after community. They have to be customized. So there are some great violence reduction initiatives. That's kind of what I would call Pacification, is a violence reduction initiative in United States policing. But there are some strategies on that very topic that are definitely working. But before I go into what is occurring in Stockton and some things we're doing there based on Dr. Kennedy's work, I'd like to first comment on some of the commonalities and the similarities that I heard yesterday from Latin America policing, community trust issues, as well as some of those very issues in my community, Stockton, California, which is a very diverse community, 40% Latino, over 10% African American. We also have a high Southeast Asian community. It's a very, very multiculturally diverse community. But some of the similarities I saw, and I think they are constants in policing, no matter where you are, no matter what nation you're from, are these things. And I took notes from yesterday. And I just appreciated listening to you all yesterday. It was very fascinating. First is the public space analogy, which is whoever owns public space in a community really defines the climate of that community. For example, and we've experienced some of this on a smaller scale in Stockton, if it's the gang members or the criminals who own the public space perceived by the community, then it's really a climate of fear that people are living in. However, on the flip side of that is if the police come in and occupy that space, or are perceived as coming in and occupying that space, we're perceived as exactly that, as an occupying force, and almost as in a military operation. So the best and only answer really is for the community itself to own their own public safety space. And that often does require law enforcement helping the community take it back. But one phrase I really don't use is we're going to go in and take back the streets. Because really we don't own the streets. They're not for us to own. They're for the community to own. So that's kind of a common thread. I also heard a lot yesterday about the root causes of crime, risk factors. Same. I heard a lot of the data from Mexico, a little bit from Colombia, as well as Brazil. The risk factors, the root causes of crime are the same. Different levels of severity in different communities. A lot of that has to do with the institutional infrastructure that's maybe within those countries. But the factors, I believe, are the same. And for one thing we know, it's a basic human nature. For a community to thrive, we first must feel safe and secure within our community. Other things then follow, such as economic development, other things. But the community first has to at least feel safe coming and going in public spaces. The other thing we heard, and I liked the phrase yesterday, was the social capital model of policing, which means nobody can do it alone. The police department can't do it alone. We require the community's help. The community certainly can't do it alone. It's truly a partnership between the community and whatever law enforcement model is in place in the jurisdiction. And when it comes to community trust, I heard a lot about yesterday about the various communities and how much they trust or distrust their police force. Believe it or not, we've experienced that exact issue in Stockton within those various communities that I mentioned. One example is I said we have over 40% Latino population in Stockton, and a lot of the population has brought their feelings or perceptions of law enforcement with them, so sometimes there's an automatic distrust of the police. We have to earn our trust. The one thing with community trust is it begins with mutual understanding and relationships. Thank you. And how we view through our various lenses. For example, sometimes there is a perception that the police officers only view a community as the high crime rate that community has. So there's a perception, and sometimes officers do become cynical over time, but they view the entire population of that community with what we call painting it with a broad brush, where, okay, they're all criminal element. We know the vast majority of people living within those communities are good people whom we need help from, and oftentimes they feel held hostage within their own communities. On the flip side, the various lenses or prisms we view things through is sometimes the community views the police as just occupiers. And so it's just finding a mutual understanding of how we view, based on our experiences, one another. So to dig in here to Stockton, we actually had one of the first in California serious gang problems. Sure, Los Angeles, a lot of you know about Los Angeles' gang problem. But Stockton, we had kind of the first what are known as the Norteño and Sureño gangs in California. Those are Latino gangs. And they really took root in the 1950s and 1960s. We have generational gang issues in Stockton. These are mostly street gangs. Some are more organized than others. Our most recent gang problems are very loose-knit gangs. Very few of our gangs have a very organized structure, but some of them do, and some of them are based on an organized structure within our prison system. But we have several hundred gangs in Stockton with several thousand gang members. Stockton, California has a population of about 300,000 people, and we have historically been just about the most violent city in California, followed only by Oakland, and many of you may have heard about Oakland. We share a lot of common gang problems. We're the second most dangerous city in California, and we've either been the 8th or 10th most violent city in the United States, based on per capita. We went through a major problem in 2008, 2009, which forced us to do things differently. It forced us to get out of a traditional policing model. We were the first, well, I should say the largest city in the nation to go through bankruptcy prior to Detroit. You've all heard about Detroit, I'm sure. So we went bankrupt as a city. We lost 100 police officers. At the same time, violent crime skyrocketed. We actually, in 2012, our homicide rates equaled the stats I saw on the screen yesterday for Mexico, for parts of Brazil. We had those same homicide rates, which was, well over 20 per 100,000. So based on that, there was a huge community outcry, and we were really looking at the impact of these homicides, what they were doing on our city with reduced police resources. So in fact, the city of Stockton had the lowest police staffing for a city our size or larger in the entire country. So we had some of the fewest officers in any city and some of the highest crime of any city in the country. We also, though, examined what is the cost of a homicide, and we know, at least for Stockton, Oakland, we've examined it. It costs the community $1 million. For every homicide, that's the cost of incarceration, that's the cost of the criminal justice system. That doesn't even cost the emotional toll on family. But you figure about $1 million per homicide, what it costs the community. So sometimes you're presented with very serious challenges which actually create opportunities. So we looked at a new way of doing business. We knew what doesn't work, and I'll start with what doesn't work. Stop and frisk policies, what we call blanket policies, where police just go into a high crime area and flood it with police and essentially just stop everybody that's out on the street. It has short-term effects on crime. It does drive crime down, but at what cost? Because it drives a barrier or a divider between the police and the community. And as we heard yesterday, without the community's assistance, without the information and intelligence we get from the community, we can't really fight crime properly. We need the community's help, and those types of policies don't work. So our new way of doing business was moving out of what we call the traditional policing model, moving into something more progressive, which was about partnerships. Partnerships with the public, partnerships with community groups, rebuilding trust between community and the police. Regional approaches. So we had a serious staffing problem. I mentioned there's no way that we had enough officers to do everything. So we partnered with our other law enforcement partners of the region, the county sheriff's office, what we call the state police, the California Highway Patrol, even some of our federal partners. But the important thing is we, Stockton, kept the lead. We didn't turn our problem over to the federal or state police. We kept the lead, but they offered resources and we took the resources. And it was more about being what we call smart on crime, being more strategic. So again, we knew that just going into a neighborhood and being aggressive or assertive with our policing tactics wasn't the answer. Through data, we're getting much better at being data-driven as a police department. We know that only 3 to 6% of our population is causing the great percentage of our violent crime. So it's just being more strategic on who we're going to address, the repeat offenders, and what we call the group violence. And we definitely rely on technology more than we ever have before. We've heard a little bit about intelligence-led policing being data-driven. I'll go over some of those technologies briefly in a moment. The one thing we had to do is change our culture in our police department to ensure everybody's on the same page of what our mission is. We knew that our gun and gang problem is what was driving our violent crime. So we put together a model, and everything that anybody does in the police department has to fall under one of these, what we call the 4 Ps. Whether it's the police officer, it's a commander, or it's even a 911 dispatcher or a clerk. Everything they do has to go to our core mission. So the 4 Ps are partnerships, pursuit, prevention, and prediction. Partnerships, we had to really get together with a regional approach with our other law enforcement agencies, also partnering with the community. Pursuit, which is going after the worst of our worst offenders. I'll talk more about that under the ceasefire model. Prevention, not just crime prevention, but educating the public to reduce their chances of being victimized. And then prediction. Really, that's better use of data-driven tools. It's predictive analysis. I'll show a couple maps in a moment, but it's just, again, policing smarter. So this is the chronology of how things began to change. In May 2012, when we were the height of our homicides, again, we were matching Mexico's homicide rates. And they were mostly, they were gang killings almost always, and it was mostly retaliation or retaliatory violence. So one gang does a drive-by shooting on this gang. We could almost predict pretty easily where the next one was going to take place based on the turf and the issues the gangs were going through. And just a few gangs were responsible for 71 homicides in Stockton. So real-time policing was just about being proactive versus reactive, getting out ahead of that next shooting that we felt was going to take place. We developed what are called community response teams, which were a team of uniformed police officers that would go into a neighborhood with a very high visibility policing method. But before they started what may be considered assertive enforcement tactics of the gang members that were out on the streets, before they began that, they would meet with the community and go over mutual expectations, so that when the community did see that high visible police presence in those neighborhoods, the community had the buy-in for what they were doing. We also began our gang outreach workers. We call them peacekeepers. And these are former gang members that the city of Stockton hires. And they then go mediate or do intervention after a shooting has taken place. They will go to the scene, go to the hospital, go meet with the families, and try to ease tension to try to intervene so that a retaliatory shooting does not take place. We found that the only people that have credibility to do that are either clergy, faith-based leaders within the community. Usually the gang members will listen to them. But I'll tell you, they won't really listen to me because I don't really understand where they've come from, and we both recognize that. That's why we hire former gang members that have truly turned their life around, because they have that credibility when they're talking with these guys. So we expanded the amount of outreach workers, gang outreach workers we had. And then a community advisory board reporting to the police chief. This then transitioned into what we call the Marshall Plan. And I believe what is unique about the Marshall Plan is it brought together at a table like this for a year straight all of what we call the stakeholders of our community. So yes, I was the police chief, but I also had my mayor. We also had the county sheriff. We had the county probation chief. We had mental health, the director of mental health. We had education, so the superintendents of our schools. We had faith-based leaders of our community. Everybody who had some part of those risk factors or those root causes of crime. And everybody in the room agreed what our community needed to do. So that is, I do understand that is unique or a little bit unusual. And that requires everybody being on the same page. We fortunately had that ability in Stockton to do that. So we created Ceasefire. What Ceasefire is it's based off of Boston's ceasefire model created by Dr. Kennedy. I will say this, Ceasefire is the most evidence-based, proven violence reduction strategy in the United States. And we implemented it back in 1997, and it worked. I'll talk about the various components of it. But then we stopped doing it. And for a number of reasons, elected officials change, police chiefs change, leadership changes, and often the passion for a program like that just dissipates and goes away. Well, when it went away, our violent crime skyrocketed again. So we've re-implemented Ceasefire, actually in the most recent version, which is the best yet. The way it works generally is that we first have everybody commit to stopping violence or curbing violence, and that all those stakeholders I mentioned. So it's not just the police department, it's community members, judges, they're at our table too. And everybody agrees that when the police department identifies those top 3% that we're going to address, that are committing the vast majority of our violent crime, everybody at the table agrees we will all address that group. We start, it's all data-driven and strategic in how we identify them. They represent groups. We invite them to what's known as a call-in that looks a lot like this room as well. I will sit and host it. A gang member will sit right on the other side of me. The U.S. attorney, a gang member, probation chief, gang member, community, so on. It's interspersed throughout the room. And we send a very clear message. We're not telling them to get out of gangs. We hope they do. We're not telling them to get a job. We hope they do. That's not the actual message. The message is to stop the violence, stop the shootings. And we have services and community there who are there for them that say if you want to get out of this lifestyle, we're here as a support mechanism to help you do that. And there's a lot. The important part is to have service providers present. But then law enforcement sends the message that we care about you too. We don't want you to shoot somebody, but we also don't want you shot, and we don't want you incarcerated. We want this violence to stop. They take that message back to their whatever group or gang they represent. But then if one of those groups does commit another act of violence, that group has been forewarned. And then we do bring all of those people I mentioned, judges, sheriff, state police, Stockton Police, and we do a very strong enforcement message on that group. But the key is it's a balance between community caring message and a strong law enforcement message that has services connected to it. We are now in the process of institutionalizing Ceasefire through the whole city of Stockton. We did have a tax measure passed, so we're getting some of those 120 officers back I mentioned we lost. But we're also opening up what we're calling an Office of Violence Prevention. And that is to do this Ceasefire model, to expand it, to make it more robust, and to spread it through the entire city. More gang outreach workers, youth outreach workers, mentoring programs. I heard a lot about prevention yesterday. That is what this Office of Violence Prevention is about, is working with the clergy, working with the community-based organizations to really expand that Ceasefire philosophy to the entire city. We know we do have to get to our next generation of offenders. This is some of the technology We have a real-time camera center, predictive analysis software, and a shot spotter technology, all donated to the city, by the way. This is about $1 million of technology here. Because we were bankrupt and because we had a lot of people want to do something for the city of Stockton, all of this was donated for free to the city of Stockton. Shot spotter actually detects and pinpoints where gunfire takes place. This is, we saw some hotspot maps yesterday. That's kind of tough. That's a lot of hotspots. But it's about taking your hottest of the hotspots, starting there because you can't hit them all at once. But Stockton is unique. We have violent crime hotspots north to south, east to west within Stockton. But we take 1 or 2 spots at a time. We only take one bite at the apple to be very strategic. So to wrap up here, based on ceasefire, our work with the community, last year we had almost a 60% reduction in homicides, 30% reduction in robberies, and over 20% reduction in violent crime in general. We still have a lot of work to do, but from lessons learned, I would say this. Spikes will happen. You have to keep your eye on the ball for the long term and for long-term drops in violent crime. Political will. It's very important to have your leadership within their community be on the same page. That's a hard part, I do understand. But data doesn't lie. If you can make it all about the data and show where you need to put your resources, nobody can really argue that. Elected officials come and go, but it's important for especially law enforcement to take a leadership role in showing where you need to go, and you need to be laser locked on violent crime for a city like Stockton. So really, a violence reduction initiative needs to be the full model, in my opinion, to have success. You have to have strategic data to do strategic enforcement. You have to send the message, and it has to be a unified message from the police, law enforcement, and the community that the violence must stop. You have to have intervention. You have to have the outreach. Some guys don't want to do the violence, and they want to walk away from the violent lifestyle. Somebody has to be there for them to help them, guide them onto the correct path. And you have to have prevention to be able to address the next generations that are coming up through the system. The intervention is on the guys out doing the crime on the streets right now. The prevention are for the next generations coming up. So it's my honor to be here, and thank you for your time today.